Hello YouTube, my name is Tyler and instead of a reading vlog, I am doing a reading check-in. It is the 20th of October. Technically there's like one more day in this week. However, my schedule is going to be a little weird the next week or two and I'm definitely not going to finish reading anything tomorrow because I've kind of finished all the books that I've been reading. Anyways, I finished 3 books this week. I was going to try and record yesterday because I finished a book yesterday that I had thoughts about, but I wanted to try and finish another book and I ended up not being able to finish it. So I finished that book today and so that's why this is being recorded in a very odd way. Anyways, so first things first, I read a comic called Fruiting Bodies by Ashley Robin Franklin. This was like a 50-page comic I read on Hoopla. It is about a girl named Fran who is moving to the Pacific Northwest to be with her partner, and she is doing this road trip with her brother and her brother's best friend, I believe, and then they run out of gas in the woods and some things occur. It's fine. Like, I gave it 3 stars. There was nothing I disliked about it, but it was really short. It didn't really give me any spooks or scares, but it's perfectly fine. I could see how it would be some people's cup of tea. It just didn't do a whole lot for me, especially because it was, you know, like I said, 50 pages. So there's like not a lot to it. So that was the first thing I read this week, and that's, I had so few thoughts that I was like, I'm not going to break out the camera just to talk about this 50-page comic for a couple minutes. So the next thing I finished yesterday was We Were Once a Family, a story of love, death, and child removal in America by Roxanne Asgharian. I listened to this as an audiobook because, you know, I love my like nonfiction in audio form these days. I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars. This is specifically about the children, the adopted children of Jen and Sarah Hart, I believe is the last name. They were the women who had 6 black adopted children and they ended up killing themselves by driving off a cliff. It was a big story a couple years ago. So this is about those children and the families they came from. It is about the child welfare system, adoption in America, how these children ended up with those women, and how the story we're told about like adoptive parents and like adopted families is so focused around the parents and the good things they're doing by adopting children, specifically in like the cases of like white parents adopting minority children. But this really focuses on Texas because all the children were from Texas DHS, not DHS, DCFS, I believe. All the children came from the Texas child welfare system and spent a lot of time with their families, how the children ended up in the system, how the system has traumatized those families and like continue to perpetuate harm against these families, but also how their stories have gotten lost in the like true crime narratives of their death, how they had to fight to get any information. None of these families were informed that their biological children were murdered. None of them. And there is a lot of societal narratives about like no one wants these children, so good on these adoptive parents. However, these families fought for these children. They were constantly being thwarted by the state. They wanted the kids to stay in the family. And they were taken over and over again. And multiple different ways, including their lives were taken by their adoptive parents. So it was a really good book. I really enjoyed it. There was one little piece that I was curious about. There was a couple different points where it seems like there is some sort of child pipeline between Texas and Minnesota. And she's from Texas, I believe, or like at least lives in Texas at this point. So she did a lot of stuff in Texas and working and describing the Texas child welfare system and how these children, how these parents get their rights stripped away from them from their children. A lot of that. But multiple times it was mentioned that children in the Texas system end up in Minnesota getting adopted, but never really got into that. And so it just left me curious, like, what is that relationship? Why are so many Texas children ending up in Minnesota specifically? Like, she described the system of like basically putting these children up for adoption on the internet. And so she described that as a thing that Texas does, but did not talk about specifically how they kept ending up in Minnesota. Is there a reason why people in Minnesota are adopting from other places that are not Minnesota? So there's that. 4 stars. Recommend. The other thing I read and finally finished, Columbine by Dave Cullen. I gave this 3.5, so it got rounded up to a 4. I don't know, I enjoyed the first like third of this, but as it got further along, I found the organization of this to be a little lacking. I wanted it to dig more and focus more on like themes, like analysis of the media. Like there's a little bit of it, but I wanted it to be organized in a different way because it is so stuck to the linear timeline. So each chapter goes back and forth between like Dylan and Eric and what they were doing in leading up to Columbine. And then the other chapters are from like what happened the day of all the way until like the present day of the book. So both timelines are working linearly, and while you're technically jumping back and forth in time, I found that main timeline that's like going through all of the ramifications of the massacre to be like too rigid. I wanted there to be more analysis and pulling together different stories together into topics, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense. That's what I was really wanting from this, because it was very easy to get lost and forget things between chapters about certain characters. Like you would hear about one character, one person affected by it, you know, many chapters before, and then they would come back later and you would forget what the deal was. I really found myself wanting a list of people involved, because he really does try and focus on the people who were impacted. He follows a number of people who had been at the school, or their children were killed, or their spouse was killed. He really focuses on those people and their stories, but they're not being mentioned in every chapter. So it was very easy to get lost. And then a few chapters later, when they come back, you're like, wait, who is this person? How is this connected? I hope that makes sense. So I really wanted like a list of characters. I keep saying characters. They're not characters. They're people. A list of people involved in this. And I just wanted it to be organized a little more thematically. That's probably like a personal preference. I like more analysis in my books. However, I don't think that's necessarily what this is. It is trying to be more of a history, telling you what happened. There is a little bit of analysis in here, but that's like not the main driving force of this narrative. Dave Cullen was like in Colorado. He did a lot of on-scene reporting, was very involved in covering Columbine when it happened. So I don't know where I was going with that thought. Another thing that kept me from giving it a true 4 was there was a chapter or two in here. Where is it? There is chapter 40, Psychopath, that is like going through, I don't know, it just left a bad taste in my mouth of going through the research about psychopathy and how Eric Harris is a psychopath, and I don't know, some of the language and the way it was talked about just left an icky thought and feeling in me while reading this. And he relies heavily on like an FBI psychologist when telling this narrative about like the mental health, well-being, illness of these boys. And I don't know. I don't want to say that can never be known, like we could never have evidence about these killers, these murderers. But I don't know, it just left me feeling a little just icky, but specifically like the psychopathy chapter, the psychopath chapter. I mean, I've always been kind of skeptical in general of like the idea of psychopaths. I'm not really sure the evidence is as there as it was made to seem in this book, but that's like I'm not an expert, and that's my personal opinion. But even if we agree that yes, psychopathy exists, people can be psychopaths, this idea that like they can never be helped, just putting them in like therapy or whatever just makes them be better psychopaths, helps them be more able to use people. Just, I don't like it. And again, this is like a personal feeling. I'm not an expert. You know, I am not reading, while I did read the endnotes, I'm not going through the bibliography and like doing all my research. But that is where I felt most critical when reading this book. That's where I found I was asking the most critical questions of the narrative being told, and just highlighting things like, but the angst we associate with teenagers was the least of Eric's drives. His brain was never scanned, but it probably would have shown activity unrecognizable as human to most neurologists. Unrecognizable as human? There's something just icky about it. Eric Harris was a human. A human did these things to other humans. A 18-year-old killed multiple teenagers in his high school. And I feel like the language in this chapter does more harm than good in trying to understand Eric Harris. It becomes he is this psychopath that could never have been helped and only wants to use people. And it makes it seem more like a cartoony villain, if that makes sense. And I don't necessarily think that is what Dave Cullen was going for, but that is what came off to me and what was leaving a bad taste in my mind. And like here talking about how people have been resistant to diagnosing minors as psychopaths, which in general there is a resistance to truly diagnosing minors because your brain is still growing until you're like in your 20s. But then finishes the sentence or the paragraph off with, but clearly many juveniles are well on their way and their way to psychopathy is what is implied in this paragraph. And I'm just like, what? Like, I don't know, this chapter just it felt bad reading that particular chapter. And so like those are the things that keep me from giving it a true like 4. But overall I did enjoy it. I do think I might probably read Parkland. He's done another book, but it probably won't be for a while, and I'm definitely not going to buy a copy. I don't think. I think I'm just going to read the copy that my library has. So those are the things I read this week. That's all that I am reading. I ended up DNFing Lake of Dead Languages. I was enjoying it, but then there was like a time rewind, and the like main characters in that rewind I hated. I hated them, and while the atmosphere was really good, I was not actually all that invested in the plot. And once I got to characters that I also hated and were going to be in the coming chapters a lot, I just could not get myself to read it anymore. So I DNF'd that, and I think I'm not working on anything else. I'm still waiting for Immortal Longings to recheck out to me. But otherwise, everything else is done. So I don't think there's going to be a vlog next week. And this is a much longer check-in than I had anticipated. So, yeah, that is what I have to say about the books I read and the books I am currently technically not reading.